one of Neil's passions was money. On the topic of where does money come from, he was actually the chair of Positive Money, which is a now very well established charity, which whose purpose of which is to educate the general public about the workings of the monetary system in the United Kingdom. And I was also closely involved with the setting up of Positive Money, and was on the advisory board for, I think, the first 5 or 6 years of its existence. Somehow missed Neil. Don't quite know how that happened. Maybe I didn't miss him. I probably have met him in some context. But anyway, my talk today really is a little bit about that. It's about the interaction really between, and my research over the last 6 or 7 years has been about the interaction between money, finance, and the housing market in high-income economies. And that's what I'll be focusing my comments on. But I'm also going to talk a little bit about the ecological challenge that we face in regard to the housing market. And I'm very interested in that interaction, which I think Neil was deeply interested in as well, between housing, people, and the planet. How can we manage social justice and an equal distribution of domestic space alongside the need to grow our economies and to stay within planetary boundaries? And this builds on some very recent work, co-authored work, that I'll talk about. So just to say one quick thing about my institute, actually, because it sounds quite sort of, there's some parallels, I think, between what Neil was trying to do. Just reading his background, his biography, is very interested in practical solutions to problems, rather than the sort of standard academic, ivory tower thinking up ideas and theory. And at IIPP, that's exactly what we're trying to do. Actually, we're very much focused on solutions to the big problems of climate change, of inequality, and the idea of missions as a way of focusing government on these major challenges. House prices. Well, they keep going up, don't they? That's been the story for a long time now. And of course, what's most interesting about the recent pandemic is, whilst GDP in high-income economies collapsed at record rates, house prices went the other way. They actually went up at record rates. So this, of course, poses a huge puzzle, because the standard explanation you'll find in economics and most other social science disciplines is house prices reflect economic growth and people's incomes. So that sort of is a nice puzzle to begin our discussion, I think. You can see there on the left-hand side a chart showing house price growth in high-income economies. The dip in 2008 following the financial crisis, a rapid recovery, and then more recently during the pandemic, we have a recovery on a similar sort of exponential scale. Just to say, there's one narrative about the pandemic is that this was all about a sort of race for space, people wanting to move to bigger properties or properties in the countryside. But actually, if you look at the data, that story isn't quite the case. This just shows you US data. You can see in all types of housing and different parts of cities, different population densities, you did have this quite remarkable increase. The UK case is the same. Essentially, we saw house prices peaking above their 2008 financial boom, followed by bust peak during the pandemic, and they've just sort of leveled off a bit recently. Now they've been picking up again. I think there seems to be an almost never-ending house price increase in this country as well. One of the main outcomes of this is that in those countries most closely affiliated with the idea of home ownership, where home ownership is deeply culturally and politically celebrated, and where policymakers talk all the time about the home owning democracy, the Anglo-Saxon economies, we've seen this remarkable decline actually in home ownership since the early 2000s, after this rapid rise in house prices in the 80s and 1990s. And what's interesting is that there's almost, across these 5 different nations, it's almost as though that trajectory has kind of coalesced together, even though they started from quite different places. So a sort of coalescing around 65-64% home ownership rate. Is slightly out of date, this chart, but that's the sort of direction of travel. So that promise that if you work hard, if you pay your taxes, you'll be able to own your own home, that promise no longer rings true, as everyone who lives in London or has children who are trying to find a house in London knows very well. They are simply priced out of the market. Let's see if I can get this thing working. So how to explain this? This is what I've been thinking about for some time. Of course, the standard explanation that you'll see politicians of every persuasion from the left and the right make is this a supply side problem. We need to build more homes. We need to rip up the planning rules. Developers need to do your duty. Most recently, we've had the current Prime Minister, Liz Truss, in a video made a couple of years ago, admittedly, talking about we've got to increase the number of houses just like they do in Germany. So there's a sort of it's almost blasphemous to talk about any other explanation for rising house prices than the supply side problem. If we go back to our long run house price to income ratio chart, this is indexed against this long run average, the black dotted line there. One explanation, well, if you buy the supply side explanation for rising house prices, you would also expect rents to have gone up relative to incomes. Okay, because if you see, if the primary objective of housing is as a consumption good, and there's not enough supply for the number of people wanting to live in a property, you would expect rents to have gone up. But if we look at not just the price to income ratio, but the price to rent, the house price to rent ratio, we see almost the same trajectory. So in fact, house prices have also exploded away from average rents. Now, of course, there are many places in the country where rents have risen at a much faster rate than incomes. London's one of them. Many of the cities in the UK, that this is a major problem, and it's a major problem in Europe. But on average, there isn't this pattern of rents rising at the same pace as house prices, home ownership, the cost of home ownership, essentially. So the supply side story doesn't work from that sort of very basic understanding of, if you understand housing as a consumption good, there's not enough of it in the market, the price of rent should go up. Same story if you look across high income economies. This is the average for 16 OECD economies, the same pattern with house prices rising very fast against rents as well as incomes, well beyond that sort of long run average. Of course, the supply side argument also cannot explain housing bubbles. The left-hand chart shows you the now famous housing bubbles in Ireland and Spain in the lead up to the financial crisis, where you sort of saw this house prices increasing kind of 10 times in a very short period of time. At the peak of that bubble, housing completions, I mean, new units coming onto the market, were 3 times higher in Ireland and Spain than across the rest of Europe. So they were building homes at a sort of record fast rate, but prices were still going up. So it seems like supply can't really help us there. What about the reality on the ground in the UK? Well, the story that the planning system is not doing its job doesn't really stack up. 90% of planning applications in the UK are approved. There was actually no real drop-off during the pandemic period. So the rise in prices during the pandemic, it seems, can't be explained very well by some contraction in supply. The UK actually has a surplus of dwellings relative to households, which has grown by 70%. That's sort of shown on the top chart there. Now, of course, in certain parts of the country, one can, I think, make the argument there are insufficient affordable homes relative to the population. These are averages we're talking about. But overall, it's not clear to me that the basic data supports this argument. Moreover, even if you sort of accept there is a relationship between new supply and prices, all the data suggests that the expansion of housing stock has a relatively limited effect on housing affordability. It's not really that surprising when you think about it. We've got 63 million people living in this country. I'm not sure how many households that is, but it's a lot. And if you build 300,000 more houses a year, it's just common sense that it can't have that much impact on actual average house prices. And the econometric studies show that a 1% increase in housing stock delivers between 1 and 2% reduction in house prices. That may sound like quite a bit in a way, but if you think about the rise we've had in house prices over the last 20 years, around 213%, you realize that this is a tiny difference. This is going to make a tiny actual difference. So yeah, the supply side never really did it for me. We can have lots of debates, I think, about the need for new supply and the need for affordable housing in certain parts of the country, but the broad argument doesn't stack up. And I think Neil was really aware of this, and he wrote a paper, I know, with Nick Gallant in 2018, I think it was, which made the argument that this must be much more to do with demand than the standard explanations, and in particular the role of demand for housing as a financial asset. But before I get to that, and that's been my main sort of focus for research for the last sort of 7 or 8 years, housing as a consumption good is also an important part of understanding, I think, what's happening in this country, and particularly the pandemic, actually. Now, the thing about housing in this country, and I think most countries, is that it has a high income elasticity of demand. And that's just economic speak for, if you're a person that starts earning more money, you become wealthier, you're going to put more of that extra pound that you receive into housing than into other goods. Basically, your demand for having a bigger garden or a bigger spare room in the house, or a bigger a lounge is very high. It's very elastic. You'll keep expanding, whereas you'll stop. When you've bought 25 pairs of trainers, the 25th pair is just not going to be that interesting to you. So this very high income elasticity of demand, and what that means is more unequal the population becomes, the more demand there is for domestic space from people who already are reasonably well housed. Okay, that's a sort of fundamental point that people, I think, don't talk about enough. So this is a major distribution problem. But as I said, my research is focused much more on the demand for housing as a financial asset. And this is a function of the availability of credit, which Neil, as I said, wrote about in this article in 2018, as well as the cost of capital, interest rates, and the running costs, including, importantly, the amount of tax you pay to own property. There's plenty of seats down here at the front. And expectations. Expectations also really important. If you believe that house prices are going to continue to rise in value for the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, you will take a bet when you get your mortgage and you buy that house. And actually, if you've taken that bet in the last, well, what is the data on this graph? Almost 250 years, it would have been a good one for the most part, because the actual average return on property, that is capital gains and rental return, has been 7% on average. Again, this is an average of high income economies. This is an article by Jordan and a couple of other economists, very good paper, which shows a mean return on housing and compares it with the mean return on stocks and shares, equity, weighted by GDP across 16 economies. The interesting thing there is the average return on equity is actually the same. It's about 7% as well, but you can see it's a much more volatile return. So it's a much riskier investment than housing. So there's this expression, safe as houses. It actually does bear some truth when you look at the data. And that means that the expectations driver for house prices is very strong, because you've got all of this history and you've got your grandparents and your parents telling you, put your money in housing, put your money in housing. Well, it's true, that has been a very good bet. But how do we explain this rise since the 1990s in particular? I think the key explanation is to do with the huge expansion in mortgage credit that was enabled by the deregulation of the banking system and the financial innovation that followed from the 80s in Anglo-Saxon countries and then more widely in Europe from the 1990s. This really was, for me, this is the sort of elephant in the room in these discussions around, the real driver of housing, house prices. And I've written widely on this problem. And again, I think Neil's very much aware of this challenge. And what's interesting about this chart, as you can see, is that the sort of textbook role of the bank, lending to businesses for investment, for working capital, you can see that steadies out in that 1990 period, levels out at around 40% of GDP, whilst mortgage credit explodes to 60, 70%. And again, this is averaged across high income economies. For the UK, it's more like 70 to 80% mortgage credit, and business investment is much lower. In fact, in the UK, just 1 in every 10 pounds that banks lend actually supports non-financial firms for investment or working capital. So, banks don't actually do the job you're taught they do in this country in the textbooks. Post the financial crisis, we have had a set of policies, macroprudential policies, stronger limits on mortgage credit being issued. There was a sort of realization that this had major financial stability problems, this explosion in credit creation. But we've had this sort of pushback in other areas. So we've had the re-embracing of mortgage-backed securities and securitization, particularly via the European Union's simple, transparent, standardized program to sort of, and the European Central Bank basically rescuing the European securitization market in 2010 when it was on the point of collapse, and of lower capital requirements for mortgage-backed securities. So, and we've also had quantitative easing as the sort of main tool used by monetary policymakers to rescue the economy, to provide liquidity, to try and get more investment and bring down interest rates. And of course, this has made housing an even more desirable financial asset for investors as well as for ordinary households, because the interest rates on mortgages has collapsed, and that means the relative yield, relative return on housing has gone up vis-a-vis other so-called safe assets, government bonds and corporate bonds in particular. And we've seen this explosion in investment vehicles such as real estate investment companies and REITs, a huge investment in the private rented sector, the social housing sector being opened up to international demand. And we get this sort of cycle of lower rates, meaning investors are able to get the initial loan cheaply, then get the property, then re-leverage against that property to get an even cheaper loan, continuing this cycle. And across the big cities of the world, we've seen prices sort of synchronizing away from the interior, the rest of the countries where they are based. So housing's become an asset class for institutional investors, just as banks were sort of leveling off a bit with this stronger regulation, having been scared by the financial crisis. We've seen this enormous flow of institutional investment into other sectors, particularly social housing and private rental sector. And this chart tries to convey the actual rather complex nature of these investments. It's a very nice paper by Daniela Gabor and Sebastian Cole for the European Green Party, which just talks through the process. Very opaque. Many of these firms hold these assets sort of off balance sheet or in fairly opaque vehicles. But there has been this enormous sort of expansion in institutional investment, pushing up rents in many cities, Berlin being one example, London's another one, because quite often they are either building to rent and pushing up the average rents in the cities where they locate these properties, or they're buying up social housing that's been sold off by austerity pushed local authorities. However, that's the sort of financialization story. In the last few years, I've been sort of thinking, is financialization the right word to describe these processes, or is, can we be a bit more imaginative about this? For me, this is really about the extraction of land rent, which was the original kind of economic rent that the founding fathers of economics actually talked about. So, Adam Smith, John Stuart Mill, Karl Marx. Economic rent was seen to be the major problem for capitalist societies, Ricardo, because landowners would extract the increase in the value of land created by economic growth and dynamism and entrepreneurial investment within economies, and suffocate consumption, the ability of businesses to invest. Now, for me, this is exactly what's been happening. And finance has just taken advantage of a sort of system where private landed home ownership has become the dominant form of tenure. This is the form of tenure that most easily enables land rent extraction, and alongside it, the privatization of public housing, the liberalization of development policy to essentially favor the original owners of the land as opposed to potentially new uses of that land. So in the UK, we have this hope value, where the owner of the land can sell it as if every single part of that plot of land will have luxury 2-bedroom flats on it, as opposed to family homes for people on middle incomes in the area. And of course, we also have a wider macroeconomic regime that favors private property, favors this tenure form. We have almost no taxes, capital gains on landed property on primary residences. We've abolished in the UK. We've abolished imputed rents. We used to have imputed rent taxes until the mid 1960s. Alongside this, we have all of these subsidies for market rents, and very low interest rates, as I've talked about, since the 2000s. And what all of this has created really is a political alignment between the interests of homeowners, middle and upper middle class households, the finance and the real estate sectors, and politicians. Because of course, once you get over 60% of the population being a homeowner, you get sort of locked into this kind of regime. And I sort of worked on this concept of rentierization whilst in Sydney, working on a paper, which you can see there with Cameron Murray. Just going back to the subsidies for homeowners, as I said, no capital gains on primary residence. Council tax in this country not been revalued since 1991. No imputed rent tax, various subsidies and various tax reliefs, and of course a hugely expanding housing benefit as well, subsidising the landlords essentially with taxpayers' money. All of this leads us to this kind of reinforcing feedback cycle, as I've described the housing finance feedback cycle, where increasing flows, deregulation leads to increasing financial flows into housing, rising house prices, increasing the ability of homeowners and banks and the real estate sector to capture land rents, leading to increased speculative demand for property as a financial asset. And governments, instead of pushing back on this dynamic, embracing it with home purchase subsidies, embracing it with the privatization of social housing, and embracing it with increasingly tax-friendly property wealth policies. Now, there's lots of explanations for why we've had this collapse in interest rates, or this secular decline in interest rates since the 2000s. For me, the deregulation of the financial sector and the creation of this vast household debt, vastly increasing private sector debt, is a reason why we've got these very low interest rates, because central banks are scared to put up interest rates, right? Because they know it will actually destroy the economy or destroy people's purchasing power, because they've got these huge mortgages, increasingly large amounts of consumer debt as well, more recently. And this has been seen, I think, in the last 6 months or a year, with the massive inflation not being met, I would say, by a proportionate increase in interest rates, or at least what the sort of orthodox economists would call a proportionate increase. Now, of course, it's a supply side driven inflation, so that argument's a bit muddy, but I think there is a huge case really for saying the deregulation of the financial sector helped embed these low interest rates. Low interest rates, of course, mean that banks need to innovate to keep generating profits, because the spread on their loans is getting squeezed with these very low interest rates. The difference between what they give you when your money's in the bank and what they charge you when you borrow. And one of the ways they did this is through innovation, particularly residential mortgage-backed securities, but as I've just been talking about, increasingly sort of bringing capital markets and institutional investors into the financing of housing through these vehicles, RMBS, REITs, etc. And all of these dynamics reinforce each other and feed back on each other, leading us to where we are today, really. And then if we take this analysis to COVID, what's happened during the pandemic, and my kind of initial question at the start of the lecture, the chart on the left just shows you this sort of gradual decline in never-ending decline in interest rates. It has now ended, of course. They're on the way up, but it fairly remarkable decline there for a long period of time. And then on the right-hand side, you can see that savings as a percentage of disposable income. Now, although GDP was collapsing during COVID, the schemes to support people's jobs, the furlough schemes, were enormously effective from a macroeconomic perspective. They did actually save people's jobs, and they did actually keep income coming in, and people actually didn't have anywhere to spend their money. Okay, they couldn't go on holiday, couldn't go to restaurants. We couldn't go to restaurants. We couldn't even buy stuff in the shops. We could buy stuff on Amazon. That's why Amazon's profits went through the roof. But overall, big savings, big increases in savings for middle and higher income earners. And this is a key part of the explanation, I think, for the rise in property prices during COVID, is there was this sort of forced savings, which we've never really experienced before, in my knowledge anyway, as an economy. And people put the money into their favorite most attractive asset class, property. And of course, the very low interest rates supported that, along with this race for space, which I think that does have a big part of the explanation. But the key point is, in contrast to the global financial crisis or the sovereign debt crisis in the Eurozone case, house prices went right up during COVID because of the low interest rates, because the middle income people had these increased savings, and because of this sudden realization that working from home was going to become a more standard thing. People wanted more space. So that point about needing more space takes me neatly into the final part of the lecture, really, which is around the ecological challenge of this race for space, this high income elasticity of demand, this never-ending, insatiable demand for more domestic space that it seems to be characteristic of high income economies and probably developing countries as well, no doubt. So I was a co-author on a really a great paper. I think it was a great paper recently published, which we called "A Home for All Within Planetary Boundaries." It was led by a guy called Sophus Emgerson, who's based in Kent, and I'm sure he's somebody Neil. And he told me today actually that he did meet Neil at a party actually a couple of years ago, and they talked about these issues, I believe. Anyway, he's a great guy, and he put together this crack team of people from different universities around the UK. So we had engineers, and I was doing the sort of housing demand side story, and he's a biologist by training. Anyway, we did this paper that looked at the ecological impact of the government's current housing policy, both in terms of what it's doing with the existing stock in terms of retrofit and the 300,000 new homes per year target. And we looked at embodied and operational emissions. And what we found was, quite remarkably, that the current scenario, the sort of business as usual existing strategy, would entirely use up the UK's net zero carbon budget compatible with a 1.5 degree rise in temperature by 2050. Which is shown in that first chart at the top. Most of this would come through the existing operational emissions from existing housing, 92%, and 12% from the new builds, the embodied emissions from the new builds, and then a smaller amount for the operational side of the new builds. So, in other words, if we carry on with our current retrofitting and new build strategy, there will be literally no carbon emissions left for any other sector at all in the UK. So the current strategy is clearly completely untenable, really. There's lots of detail. I'm not familiar with the methodology that was used, but it's pretty robust. We actually looked at two different ways of modeling carbon emissions, and this is all tied to existing policy kind of guidance. We also modeled a second scenario where there was the same rate of new build, but much better retrofitting standards. So all new builds would be zero carbon from 2035, and existing stock retrofitted to the current standard for today. That still used up 70% of the UK's cumulative emissions. And then a third scenario with a much more ambitious retrofit, where the existing stock achieves zero emissions by 2050, and we stop building. We have sort of net zero additional new homes by 2035, and that gets us down to 60%, which still sounds like a lot, but is more reasonable given the fact that housing has proved to be the hardest sector of the economy to decarbonize, I believe, over the last sort of 10 or 20 years. And one of the reasons for that is that essentially the use of concrete, as I understand it, at least there's people in here who know this better than me, so I'm skating on water a bit, but the concrete industry has essentially said it's going to be much harder for them to decarbonize than most other relevant sectors. So for example, the electrification, the decarbonization of the electricity grid can make a big impact in bringing down carbon emissions. So what all of this means really is that the big hit to emissions will come in the later period. This chart just shows you the government's sort of predictions for carbon emissions over different periods, and you can see the biggest hit from the housing sector comes in the later period, where other sectors have successfully decarbonized, but the the embodied carbon, in particular the concrete and construction materials, consume a larger proportion of the budget. And this is a quote from another paper, which essentially makes the same argument that actually the reducing average floor space per capita is a highly effective mitigation strategy for decarbonisation. This was a global survey. The other thing we did in the paper, which I haven't talked about, is we also looked at the biodiversity impact of the existing carbon strategy, in particular the new builds, and again found that this would essentially break the UK's biodiversity commitments if we were to carry on as is. Now, what does this mean? You know, how do we need to rethink our approach to housing and housing affordability given these ecological constraints? Well, I think it means we've got to start thinking about the distribution of existing domestic space, because we know we can't just keep building, and we know we need to find a way. We know we need to retrofit on a massive scale, but we also got to think about using the existing space more efficiently if we're going to stay within our carbon limits and our biodiversity limits, our planetary boundaries. Now, apologies to those of you who are over 65 in the audience, but the average story for you guys is not good. You own almost
the long term, the medium term, and the short term.
Yeah, in terms of your current housing wealth, anyway, you've got almost half of it, and in terms of extra bedrooms, you're doing very well as well. So you know, this is a paper by Neil Hudson in the FT, which came up quite recently. The broader point, of course, is that the distribution of housing from an ecological and a social justice point of view is very problematic in this country. As it happens, older people also have the leakiest and least fuel efficient, least well insulated homes in the country, which is another part of the story in this article. So, you know, the obvious thing to start thinking about, I think, is how do we allocate that space more efficiently? And I'll you know, finish off really with some thoughts on policy alternatives. Financial regulation and reform is the area that I've worked on most closely. Macroprudential policy, as I said, was quite effective in the post-financial crisis period in reducing bank credit. It's been less effective with that institutional investment, that wall of money seeking yield. So I think it needs to be extended to also cover institutional investors and the so-called shadow banking sector. I've written a paper on that quite recently. But I think we need to go further. We need to be thinking about credit guidance. And this is a form of policy that was used in the post-war period very effectively, where a central bank would get together with the Ministry of Finance and Industrial Policy. What are the strategic sectors we need more credit flowing into? What are those we want less credit? Housing was one of the sectors where everyone agreed we wanted less money flowing into it because it was seen to be highly speculative and push up prices. Consumer credit was the same. These sectors were systematically repressed by central banks and ministries of finance, and other sectors like high value added manufacturing and exports and actually making useful things and creating jobs were supported. I think we need to see a return to those types of policies. I've also written quite a lot about the need for having different types of banks that actually de-risk their lending, not based on whether or not you own a house or your collateral, but whether or not your business, whether the bank can understand your business is a worthwhile investment, i.e. your inventories, your flows of income, a credit history of your income as an alternative. Doing that means you need to get to know the business as a bank, or get to know the local or the regional economy. So it's been, you know, typically cooperative banks in Germany or Switzerland, or public banks with a sort of regional focus, owned by people living there or owned by businesses living in the area that have been best at doing this. And that's one reason why Germany and Switzerland had quite a good financial crisis, actually, relative to Anglo-Saxon economies, where we have these this homogenous kind of big shareholder-owned bank that wants to make big loans, mainly against property, and it definitely wants to de-risk those loans by having housing as its main form of collateral. So on planning, planning is a key tool to deal with this problem, quite obviously. And I think we need to move on from this idea that planning is the problem. Planning is simply the existence of planning is simply the result of this incredible tension between the fact we all want more domestic space and there just isn't enough space and there isn't enough resources to give everyone what they want. Planning is the way of dealing with that problem. My own view is all new builds should ideally be net zero affordable housing. Clearly, we don't have models in this country that currently enable that. The main model for housing associations is to subsidize affordable housing with quite expensive market housing. But there are examples where they are doing this more effectively. One way that local authorities can afford these kind of projects is by capturing the increase in the land value that's created through the projects and the investments that they make. This is the Singaporean model, essentially, where they own 90% of the land is owned by the Singapore government, and they lease out the land for building, housing, and other uses, and capture the land value via various instruments. In terms of the macroeconomic regime, we clearly need a complete reform of the tax system. The tax system currently punishes workers and businesses for investment, and it allows the rentiers, the landlords, the homeowners, and the many other forms of rentiers, of course, energy rentiers, as we've discovered. So that the burden of taxation needs to move on to land rents and away from businesses. But it needs to take into account this challenge, this challenge of climate change and biodiversity. So offsets, if you're making your home greener, would be a very sensible approach. I think a sort of green land value tax, perhaps. And house prices, I think, need to be somehow reflected in monetary policy. We can't have a monetary policy that's only focused on consumer prices and ignores what's happening to asset prices. This is kind of insane approach, really, to interest rates. And then, of course, finally, much more attention to the existing stock, major investment in retrofit, which I think is the sort of the biggest win-win-win of any policy in any advanced economy right now, but in particular this economy, where we have actually some of the worst insulated homes in Europe, and the biggest gap in terms of the amount that the poor pay on energy relative to the rich of any European country other than Estonia. I was seeing the other day. So a huge Green New Deal focusing on retrofit is clearly key. I'll just finish on a brighter note. I was in Barcelona recently at a conference where I was given a tour of some of their housing projects, and they have a very radical socialist mayor, as some of you may know, Ada Colau, and a very radical housing manager, Javier Duron Cuadrado. And this is just an example of some of their social housing on the right-hand side. Incredibly beautiful social housing on reclaimed industrial land, which they've sealed over. And if you can see it, the plan on the right-hand side, they've created these buildings with these sort of cut-throughs designed by an architect, so that in any one of those living spaces, the residents will have at least 2 hours of sunshine in the winter, in December, the month with the least sun. You can see the sort of diagrams just showing the rotations, but various sustainable, very sustainable projects with big plastic balls put inside all of the concrete to reduce concrete usage, and various other sophisticated techniques. Yeah, this just lists. They're not only doing new build, that's an interesting thing, they're also doing these big surveys of the existing property that is there, and raising taxes on underoccupied or unoccupied homes, or purchasing those those homes from the private sector and turning them into affordable social rentals. And they're doing some very interesting public-private partnerships. So I think there is hope, but I think public sector has a key role to play. It needs to rediscover its confidence on housing, and I think it's possible, but at the moment we obviously got a long way to go in this country. I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.